Chapter 11. The Fall of Jerusalem and the Temple. O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, which killest the prophets, and stonest them that are sent unto thee, how often would I have gathered thy children together, as a hen doth gather her brood under her wings, and ye would not. Luke 13:34. The Jewish conspirators were not satisfied with just the death of Jesus, they persecuted his followers, and even imprisoned and killed them. For years God's patience had been constrained until he used the Romans in 70 AD to bring retaliation against the Jews. Jerusalem had become a den of thieves, full of corruption and murder. Wickedness and dishonesty increased among Jewish citizens and leaders alike until conditions reversed and Romans became the aggressor. Not only had the Spirit of the Lord left them, but also common sense, kindness, and fairness. The Romans, who themselves were known for their crimes and viciousness, now had rivals among the Jews, and they could no longer tolerate such uprising troublemakers. It would now become one evil force against another. The claims of treason and sedition that the Jews had hurled at Christ were now the very crimes of which they were accused. The Romans knew that such a rebellious people must be controlled. Thus the Roman soldiers, under the leadership of Titus, surrounded the city, and everything was ready for their attack. Suddenly the general withdrew his forces for no known reason. However, this action was a sign the fulfillment of a prophecy by Jesus. And when ye shall see Jerusalem compassed with armies, then know that the desolation thereof is nigh. Then let them which are in Judea flee to the mountains, and let them which are in the midst of it depart out, and let not them that are in the countries enter thereinto. Luke 21:20-21. Shortly thereafter, a mass exodus of Christians left Jerusalem because they knew what was coming, leaving the city and its inhabitants to their fate. It was the time of the Feast of Tabernacles, causing a great influx of Jews to come to Jerusalem for the celebration. Because of that, the Christians made their escape unnoticed and unmolested, and went to the city of Pella beyond Jordan. The Romans retreated because news had reached them of the death of Caesar, and they awaited orders from the new leader. He put General Titus in command and gave them orders to attack. Once again Jerusalem was surrounded. However, it was not an instantaneous attack that caused the suffering at first, it was starvation. Titus knew their provisions were low, so he just let them starve to encourage them to surrender. But instead it just spurred the Jews on to more anger and hatred. Some would sneak out at night to get food and would be captured, tortured, and then crucified before the eyes of other Jews. Such was the fate of hundreds of Jews. Then the worst came. Titus at last decided to take the temple by storm. He determined, however, that if possible it should be saved from destruction. But his commands were disregarded. After he had retired to his tent at night, the Jews, sallying from the temple, attacked the soldiers without. In the struggle, a firebrand was flung by a soldier through an opening in the porch, and immediately the cedar-lined chambers about the holy house were in a blaze. Titus rushed to the place, followed by his generals and legionnaires, and commanded the soldiers to quench the flames. His words were unheeded. In their fury the soldiers hurled blazing brands into the chambers adjoining the temple, and then with their swords they slaughtered in great numbers those who had found shelter there. Blood flowed down the temple steps like water. Thousands upon thousands of Jews perished. A soldier, unperceived, thrust a lighted torch between the hinges of the door. The whole building was in flames in an instant. The blinding smoke and fire forced the officers to retreat, and the noble edifice was left to its fate. It was an appalling spectacle to the Roman. What was it to the Jew? The whole summit of the hill which commanded the city blazed like a volcano. One after another the buildings fell in, with a tremendous crash, and were swallowed up in the fiery abyss. The roofs of cedar were like sheets of flame, the gilded pinnacles shone like spikes of red light, the gate towers sent up tall columns of flame and smoke. The slaughter within was even more dreadful than the spectacle from without. Men and women, old and young, insurgents and priests, those who fought and those who entreated mercy, were hewn down in indiscriminate carnage. The number of the slain exceeded that of the slayers. The legionnaires had to clamber over heaps of dead to carry on the work of extermination. After the destruction of the temple, the whole city soon fell into the hands of the Romans. The leaders of the Jews forsook their impregnable towers, and Titus found them solitary. He gazed upon them with amazement, and declared that God had given them into his hands, for no engines, however powerful, could have prevailed against those stupendous battlements. Both the city and the temple were razed to their foundations, and the ground upon which the holy house had stood was plowed like a field. In the siege and the slaughter that followed, more than 1 million of the people perished. The survivors were carried away as captives, sold as slaves, dragged to Rome to grace the conqueror's triumph, thrown to wild beasts in the amphitheaters, or scattered as homeless wanderers throughout the earth. The Jews had forged their own fetters, they had filled for themselves the cup of vengeance. In the utter destruction that befell them as a nation, and in all the woes that followed them in their dispersion, they were but reaping the harvest which their own hands had sown. The Great Controversy, Ellen White, pages 36 to 38. Picture of Temple. Herod's Temple in Jerusalem. Taken from Jewish Ink, 1290. Today, there is not much left of the Jewish temple at Jerusalem, but immediately after it was destroyed, the Romans built a great arch in Rome to commemorate Titus and his victory over the Jews. It is still standing today. Picture of Arch of Titus. The Jewish Encyclopedia describes this important arch. Arch of Titus, a triumphal arch erected at Rome in honor of the Emperor Titus and in celebration of his victory over the Jews. It rises on the prominent part of the Via Sacra, about 20 yards above the Tiber. One of its faces fronts the Colosseum, the other, the Forum. Under the pontificate of Pius VII, the arch was restored in its lateral portions, which had become injured by time. 3 bas-reliefs adorn the passage of the arcade. One, on the Colosseum side, shows Titus, crowned by victory, standing upright in a cart drawn by 4 horses and conducted by a female personifying the city of Rome. The second represents Roman soldiers without weapons, crowned with laurels, and carrying the spoils of the Temple of Jerusalem. The third bas-relief, under the vault, exhibits Titus sitting on an eagle, as he appears on the medal struck to consecrate his apotheosis. A tradition, which still prevails in Rome, says that formerly no Jew ever passed under this arch, and that, in order to go from the Colosseum to the Capitol, the inhabitants of the Theto opened a way between the arch and the Palatine. Jewish Ink, 12164. The first temple of the Lord mentioned in recorded history is probably the portable tabernacle commissioned by Moses. The next was the temple built by Solomon, who stood on a bronze scaffold and dedicated it about the year 1004 BC, 2 Chron. 6. However, 5 years after Solomon died, it was raided, ransacked and corrupted. After several centuries, it was in a terrible and decaying condition, and was finally looted and sacked by Nebuchadnezzar in 587 BC. Another temple was begun when refugees from the Nebuchadnezzar raid returned to rebuild the first one in 537 BC. It lasted for nearly 500 years. Next was Herod's Temple. It was begun in 19 BC and was all but finished in 10 years. This is the one that Christ came to and the one the Romans destroyed in 70 AD. Then in our dispensation, during the restoration of all things, once again the Lord instructed that a temple be built. In 1831 he designated the place for the city of Zion, which was to be called the New Jerusalem, and the gathering place for the saints, in Jackson County, Missouri. However, the saints did not live up to their privileges and God's expectations, the same as in ancient times, and they too were driven out of that land, and have lived in a scattered condition up to the present, with the temple still to be built in the future. After nearly 2,000 years, in 1947 the Jews began to gather back to their temple site in Old Jerusalem. After nearly 170 years, the saints are still anticipating the redemption of their New Jerusalem temple site. Thus, in the final days of this earth, there will be 2 Jerusalems, the new and the old. The house of Joseph, Ephraim and Manasseh, will gather to the New Jerusalem, and Judah will gather to the Old Jerusalem. The other tribes will gradually come to receive their blessings under Ephraim. The 10 tribes were not a righteous, holy and faithful people, but have been a captive and scattered people since the days of Nebuchadnezzar. They will be among the last to be gathered.